Good afternoon, and thank you very much indeed for joining our Masterclass session. Today, we are joined by Matt Fincham and Alex Clare, who is going to be discussing PR and reputation management. This is part of our 7-part series on really helping businesses rethink and reboot post-COVID. So thank you very much indeed, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. It's great to be joined by 2 PR experts who are going to share their insights, thoughts, and really give us some interesting sound bites of what businesses can do during these difficult times, really to sort of reboot and rethink their PR strategy. Before I hand over to Alex and Matt, just as way as an introduction on myself, my name is Alice Weightman. I'm the founder and CEO of The Work Crowd and Hanson Search. The Work Crowd is an online platform that connects businesses directly with talented freelancers across marketing and comms. We've built a community of over 5,000 vetted freelance experts across the UK, Europe, and the Middle East, supporting businesses on project-based work. So today, we're going to be discussing PR and reputation management. And I think before we jump in, I'm going to go to you, Alex, first of all. Maybe you could give us a little snippet of your background and experience, and then really sort of tell people a bit about what you've experienced in terms of the media and PR during COVID, and now that we're coming out, and really sort of what businesses should be thinking about.
Oh, absolutely. So thanks very much for the opportunity to join the webinar today. It's something that it's good to really get involved with. So just a little bit of background about me. I mean, I started in PR really in the late 90s, when you literally used to have to type a press release out by hand almost, and then have it biked across the London or literally on a motorbike. And I worked mainly for consumer brands in the late 90s, and then going through now working much more on sort of B2B brands, sort of in the technology sector and financial technology sector in particular. But I was also fortunate enough to work for the public sector as well, for local government, and also for last year as interim head of comms at the Green Party. So in terms of public relations, I would certainly say that I've done a lot, certainly in terms of the sectors that I've covered and so on. Having said that, I feel I'm learning all the time, really about the industry, particularly now when we're all, stuck at home effectively on lockdown, and that has had its own, that's affected the way that we must operate as well, and the way industries generally are operating. I'll just say, I just was thinking that it would be a good idea just to sort of think about where we are really as an industry more broadly, in terms of the COVID crisis. And I have to say that both in terms of COVID and in terms of PR, on the face of it, or in terms of the media landscape, on the face of it, both look pretty grim. That said, I think there is a positive, there is a positive future. But let me just sort of, cover the grim bit off first, if you like. First of all, we know that the economy shrank by 20% in April. We're looking at the worst recession in living memory. The OECD said that Britain is likely to suffer the worst damage from COVID in any country in the developing world. That's based on the fact that we are we're a very international economy, very much a service-driven economy as well. So it looks pretty poor from that point of view. And also, the COVID crisis is affecting multiple sectors simply because companies are now very reticent to invest, and they're not quite sure where to really, put their money, just, where and how they're going to kind of direct their marketing budgets. That said, there are reasons. Well, before I go into the sort of reasons to be optimistic, just looking again at more the negative side, for PRs, we're looking. One thing that when I noticed when I joined, the industry in the late 90s, we had a really healthy newspaper industry there. Many people going into journalism. Newspapers were still in great shape. I do remember I went into, cut a long story short, I found myself in the Village Voice, in the editorial office of the Village Voice in New York in 2000. And I remember asking somebody in all seriousness, the journalist there, how do I look something up on the internet? And she said, well, there's this website called Google. So that's really subsequently changed everything, and we can see now that the traditional media, particularly in print, is really suffering. The Guardian made 180 redundancies just the other week. The BBC have to make 125 million in savings a year. Channel 4 have cut 150 million off their budget. Pretty awful stuff, I would say. That said, ultimately, people and companies need to find an outlet, to be noticed. And in terms of the media landscape, we're going to see an evolution here, I think, more towards podcasts and more towards radio. We saw, that Times Radio recently launched a podcast, which I think is very interesting, and we could see newspapers becoming radio stations. And if you like, a sort of, you'll see a more of a convergence of different types of media all joining onto one platform, primarily digital. And this offers opportunity, obviously, for companies to be noticed or to be seen, and for PRs to use that platform to get them seen. Added to that, Andrew Bailey, Governor of Bank of England, has said the economy is slowly starting to recover. He's not quite sure how far it's going to recover, but he's seeing some green shoots, particularly in housing and car market sales. And looking further afield, the global market in AI is set to rise by about 100 billion in 2025. Then we have also the green economy emerging, where we've got, the European Union, for example, committing in the region of 2 trillion euros to helping the green economy. So just to step back, what I've said is really that we are right now in a pretty grim position, particularly in terms of our economy. The media is looking like in a pretty difficult time as it sort of transitions from traditional media through to digital media. But I think, and I'm not really an optimist generally, but I do think this is actually an opportunity to be optimistic. This is a time to be optimistic. I think in going through this difficult period, we will start to see opportunities for companies and PRs really to get out there. So what do I mean by getting out there? I mean, I suppose, the topic of this webinar was really what can PRs, do for companies? In short, everybody ultimately needs to sell something somewhere. We've seen that the economy is really just absolutely, and it needs that all the time. I mean, there is a better quote, and that often I think wrongly attributed to Thomas Jefferson, but the quote is, the man who stops advertising to save money is like the man who stops the clock to save the time. And what I think the PR can really do in this scenario, and then this is the crucial thing, is that they have got to find the middle ground between what you're trying to sell, whether it's a product or a service or an idea. You've got to find the middle ground between that and the news agenda, okay? And often there can be quite a difference between the two, particularly if you're selling to a very technical audience. For example, you might be selling air conditioners, or you might be selling a piece of financial software. While that's interesting to a certain audience, the challenge, the skill of the PR is to get you to talk to kind of engage outside of your constituency. So, for example, if I'm tasked to get, an air conditioner product into Air Conditioner Monthly, well, that's all very well. That's fine for a particular audience, for the stakeholders, so the customers and the partners of that company. But really where you're going to get the coverage that's going to really resonate is if you can find why air conditioners are of value, to the man or woman on the street. Why is that particularly interesting? Often a company will think that they're interesting in its own terms, but really the media won't be interested. So you've got to find, as I could say, you've really got to find that middle ground. There you'll be able to get that coverage that's going to be far more high profile, and that's going to create that emotional resonance with the brand. And I think creating an emotional resonance, as we're going to see going forward, is going to be much more important. So coming back to the kind of Air Conditioner Monthly scenario, I don't just want to get into Air Conditioner Monthly, I want to get you into the Sunday Times, I want you to get you into the BBC. That's going to give you your high profile coverage. That's going to create that emotional resonance between your brand or your product and the wider community. Doing that will help you to really stand above the competition, and over time, and it's crude to say it, help sell your product. But ultimately, PR is a sales job. I mean, it's not a very fashionable thing to say, but ultimately it comes down to that. But if it's going to do that, then it has to resonate with a wider audience. It has to be able to give your product visibility in a shrinking media market. And that's not easy, but it's exactly where the PR's skill really lies. So I'll kind of stop there, and if you've got any questions based on that, I can come back to you with the type of training that PRs ought to be doing. But that was the strongest sort of message that I really wanted to come across with today.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. That's really useful, and it's nice to hear your sort of insights and thoughts. Before we fire off any questions, which I've got lots of questions now to ask you based on that, and the audience can also use the tools at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions. I'm going to hand over to Matt. Matt, maybe you could just give us a little snippet of your background before you sort of share your thoughts also.
Sure. Thank you, Alice. And thank you, Alex. I'm learning a lot already myself. Good morning, everyone, or rather good afternoon. My name's Matt Fincham, and I'm a freelance PR consultant. I run my own business, Finch PR. I've worked in PR in London since I left the army in 2007, where I was a media officer, and that's where I started my PR career. So I've worked as a freelancer for a dozen agencies, including some of the big names, particularly on the tech side of London PR agencies. And I now work from home in Fulham, concentrating on technology in finance.
Great, thanks, Matt. Do you want to sort of share a bit of your insights in terms of, I guess the impact of COVID, and now what you're seeing in terms of PR strategies that are coming out as we sort of ease down happens, and we're all sort of looking to reboot and rethink our businesses?
I think it's been a really interesting time in PR. There's been some business models which are failing, and some businesses which are succeeding. Sometimes against the odds, despite COVID-19, and sometimes they're succeeding perhaps because of COVID-19. I think if you look at some of those who have lost reputation in one way or another, not always because of their own fault. You look at some of the holiday destinations which are going to be suffering around the Mediterranean. Some might be bouncing back, but Italy is now, for example, known to have sustained tragic losses under COVID-19, and that's going to affect them for a long time. You look at China, there's a lingering suspicion that they may have not acted in the world's best interest, and that's going to affect their reputation in business circles as well. And then some industries. For example, I work a bit in aviation and aerospace, and that's been particularly hard hit, and that will be hard hit for years. It won't be a quick bounce back for them. We've already seen people like BA selling off some of their fleets of aircraft, and they won't be purchasing any new aircraft anytime soon. And then those who work in the events industry, so a lot of conferences being cancelled, and some of those conferences perhaps didn't have a strong business model anyway, and I don't think they'll be reappearing. There'll be some conference series which simply don't start up again. There won't be enough business travel perhaps to actually sustain those, and the margins just weren't there. And then closer to home here in London, some city centre offices and co-working spaces. It's going to be very hard for co-working spaces to try and get people to come back into work, and people start to focus on their bottom line, what they need out of a working space. They're starting to think about, can they work from home, and also depending on their view on the pandemic and the relative issues around infection, they might not want to be mixing with a whole load of other people in a shared office. Just thinking about some of the business winners. Zoom, Microsoft Teams have been big winners out of this, and I think a lot of people on this call will be regular users of those platforms, and perhaps they weren't before. Perhaps they use them every now and again, and now they're a daily event. And I don't think people will necessarily go back. That actually goes outside. That actually goes outside business. I was on a church service at the weekend, and they are going to continue to have, in the foreseeable future, some sort of ongoing online presence. So they'll keep on streaming their Sunday services. So it goes to all walks of life. I suppose Amazon, Ocado, those people delivering at home, there's still a lot of people shielding and want to use those kind of services. And it's affected some advertising and social media brands as well. Some have seen their revenues go up as they've been able to pivot into the new normal. When it comes to some of the sort of PR winners, so that's the business winners. Well, what about the PR winners and losers? Well, who had heard of NHS Charities Together back in January? So until Captain, now Sir Tom Moore's amazing sort of fundraising efforts, no one had heard of that charity. And I think they cleverly were able to leverage the NHS, huge NHS brand, and the support for the NHS by and indeed almost deliberately confuse the two, to go out to the public with this well marketed and well PR'd campaign. Someone else getting it right, Kraft Heinz were one of the companies which realised that if they donated to charity in the right way, then this would appeal to the public at a time when people started to think that actually larger brands were going to suffer less. And then you got some large brands getting it wrong. For example, Jeff Bezos, Amazon's CEO, encouraged the public in a tweet to donate for a fund to his employees. Well, his employees have got jobs, and he's the world's richest man. So that might be something that he might have kept in-house and internal, and not personally be seen to encouraging, because obviously a lot of other causes he could have contributed to. So looking on and move on to the media relations environment. So what have we seen? We've seen the national media totally focused on COVID-19, and any PR back in particularly March, April, May, trying to get anything in which didn't have a COVID-19 angle, you'd have been really pushed. And it even pushed, the royals and that kind of thing, and celebrities off the front pages. The trade media I found were more split. So some wanted that COVID-19 angle, even in trade where it wasn't an obvious follow. I was talking to some investment media, and one chap said, well, I really need a COVID-19 angle. Which surprised me. Before Christmas, he'd been quite happy to take the same sort of story as I was pushing. But someone else, similar media, completely different. They were done with COVID-19 as a shoehorned in angle within weeks. And they were quite happy to start actually sort of doing slightly more business as normal, really from sort of April, May time onwards. A lot of events, as I mentioned, were being cancelled, and that actually dominated a lot of trade media who play off events. So often the journalists in trade media will go to events, they'll get a load of headlines out of those events, and it's a milestone in the business calendar for a lot of industries. And therefore, when big trade events were cancelled, maybe the sort of the hallmark, the big event in Q2 suddenly got binned in a particular industry, that would suddenly make the front pages. So that did then skew the media agenda. You have to fight your way past those with your news story to get into your favoured trade media bit. And as a general point, for those of us who perhaps in London do a lot of face-to-face or used to meet media and introduce clients, suddenly that wasn't happening at all. Not an option at all to take your client for a coffee with a relevant journalist. And so then everyone has to pivot into things like Zoom. So I'll crack in straight into some lessons for those enterprises who are thinking about either engaging someone in PR or thinking about sort of trying to do some of their own and maybe have someone in-house. So first of all, before embarking on media relations, you need to make sure you get your owned channels, so that's website and social media, updated. So they're carrying all the relevant messages and information. So if a journalist or a reader of a publication wants to look for further information on you, it's there. And the classic thing is I always say to journalists, if a journalist picks up my pitch on you and they look at your website and you don't have a website, you've got no credibility. They won't action what I'm doing. And so you need to have those building blocks in place. Messaging and aims. There's no point doing PR unless you know what you're trying to communicate and who you're trying to communicate to. So, for example, I'm sometimes asked to do PR in support of businesses raising money. So it'd be important for them to have in their news or what they're talking about messages about their fundraising and looking at the type of publication who might take that. So maybe a startup publication or maybe an investment publication. So what makes a news story? So looking at news stories, hard news stories first. So launching a product or a service, yes, that's news. A new brand, a new company, yes, that's news. New investment, that's news. New staff, a new office, a survey, that's news. An existing product, which isn't new, not news. And one of the things I've got in capital letters in front of me is media launches. Go hard or go home. You've got one chance to launch your product or your brand. And sometimes I get approached by companies who have basically botched their launch, and they ask me, look, can you help me with this? And I check them out, and it turns out they tried to launch this 2 weeks ago and they did it wrong. I can't help them. You cannot launch twice. And so make sure you get everything, all your ducks in a row and everything right the first time, because you then need to move on to something else. So if you don't have news, what do you do? What are your non-news options? So you can look at commentary and thought leadership options. So where you're writing an article about something that you know about, you've identified an issue in your market. Think about what insight you have that no one else has. For example, do you have figures? Do you have perhaps a technology platform, or have you done a survey of your members, which gives you access to figures, to insight that other people don't have? Well, then you can use that to interest an editor in your view. And particularly if you know something which other people don't seem to know or don't seem to acknowledge, that's a good starting place for an article. Alex mentioned podcasts and the new news. These are much more common, and they don't always require a hard news angle. You don't need to have launched something that week to be of interest to a podcast. Some podcasts, for example, some of the trade media are having these podcasts now, and they have a voracious appetite. They need people every week. So if you can get in touch with them and offer an interesting point of view and say why it's relevant now, then you can get on their list to be on that podcast. Quite an interesting or a useful way of getting an idea on what's good to talk about is to use your own customer feedback. What impresses your customers? What demand and what challenges are your customers seeing? If you can talk about that demand, you can talk about what matters to your customers, you're going to gain more customers when you come out with an article which shows that you really understand those issues. You understand those issues, then the other potential customers will see that and go, oh, I tell you what, these guys really know our market. When you're pitching for a new opportunity, take time to craft that pitch when you're making your approach. So pitching is making your approach to a journalist. Look at what that journalist writes about. Look at what the publication writes about. And so make sure that they are the right publication to be approaching.
Thank you, Matt. I mean, that's a good note for me to ask my first question on, because Alex, you mentioned about how there's a lot of cutbacks happening in the media. I mean, that's going to hit the commercial and editorial teams and journalists. Is this an opportunity for PRs? You're talking about the summertime as well, which historically isn't a great time to PR. So is there a real opportunity to PR right now?
Yes, I would say there is. I mean, I think PRs really can become, content channels in their own right, or certainly content creators in their own right. So, for example, if you run a trade website, which is, incredibly, short-staffed or furloughed staff and so on, the PR, if they have the right content and the right material, they can help furnish that. And the website will know, the platform will know that it needs an audience, it needs fresh content, and the PR can be the person to supply that. Now, if all the PR does is supply a load of marketing bump to that website, that's not really very good. It's not something the editor's going to enjoy. So the PR's really got to apply their journalistic skill in supplying that content, effectively being the ghostwriter, for that publication or for their spokesperson. So in short answer, yes, they can, because the media doesn't stop, regardless of the time. Does that answer your question there on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, have you got any thoughts on that? About now being a good time?
It comes from experience. I've noticed in previous years that the journalists sometimes have time at this time of year, and that there's a deluge of news releases which come out in September. People companies will hold those back after the summer. They believe that their clients and other people won't be there to notice it. So it's a balance. I mean, if you're a very big brand with big news, you can go out with it whenever you want. But for the rest of us who aren't, Lloyd's Bank, hiring a new CEO or something, then you need to pick your time. I've noticed anecdotally that I had a journalist from the FT call me up about this time last year. I hadn't spoken to her for a couple of months, and she was obviously going through all the leads she'd had from all the conversations she'd had, calling people up to ask if they got any news. Quite flattering to be called up by the FT, but it just shows you that it was a good time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of hearing that because there are these cutbacks, almost having stories that they can put into the news it helps them do their job faster. So, and in terms of the type of messaging, rewind to sort of the beginning of COVID. COVID did dominate the news. It was probably very hard, as you mentioned. I think Alex, you mentioned it was even hard for the royal family or celebrities to be even out there, never mind businesses. Have you sensed that that's moved on? And is the media looking for different type of more positive stories coming out now?
That's a very good question. I am seeing a little bit more on the positive side. I mean, what's interesting is at the beginning, clients were very nervous about engaging with COVID, and the stories in the media are all, accordingly very negative. Now I think they are becoming, clients are certainly not shy to talk about it. Obviously they don't want to shoehorn it into a story where it just doesn't fit, but it seems natural to talk about COVID really in any context and to follow the flow of the news. I haven't sensed that journalists want to, are actively looking for positive stories about COVID, but do keep in mind that when, that as a business, when you're putting a story out there, journalists are always interested in what's counterintuitive, okay? So what sort of goes against what's being said currently in the media. If you can find an interesting way to look at things a little bit differently, that can help generate can help generate interest.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's my answer to that one.
Matt, what's your thoughts?
I'd agree, actually, and I think Alex makes a really good point about the counterintuitive aspect. I've seen some media requests come in, and I have had conversation with journalists where they are looking for those who have done well, not perhaps because of COVID-19, but despite COVID-19, but also particularly those who have managed to pivot and expand their business perhaps in a new direction. And so, I guess we can all think of, examples of perhaps consumer-facing businesses like pubs who've started sort of, selling on the doorstep or selling something they wouldn't normally sell. But it might be those companies that have realised that there's a new outlet. So, for example, I'm working with a company which has a logistics technology, and they're about to start using that for COVID-19 supplies. So that would be test kits and that kind of thing. And so that's a way that they've managed to pivot out of that in a legitimate way. The bit to take advice, or the area to be careful in, is not to shoehorn a COVID angle in where it doesn't belong.
Absolutely, I would definitely echo all of that. I would say also what's interesting is that as Matt was saying, this is a time of change, and companies and organizations are changing their approach because they're having to. That allows us as PRs to create a narrative around that where it's appropriate. I saw a report out by Forrester only a few days ago, the analyst Forrester. It's very interesting. And they're basically saying over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a greater use by companies of their data to generate kind of emotional engagement amongst their end users. And again, that's an interesting areas that PRs can work in as well. I mean, I did want to echo a couple of points that Matt raised, if that's right, which I thought were just really spot on, is that when you're trying to get noticed in the media, what's gold dust really is fresh information or fresh data, okay? So you can get this in two ways. You can either commission a survey, which frankly, I don't think it's the best. It has been used a lot. I don't think it's the best thing in the world. I think it's what's more interesting if you can get insights, as Matt was saying, and data from your customers. That the material that you're getting there is far fresher and far bespoke. Then you work out what to do with it. There's two things there really. You can either create your press release and then fire it off to the world. I don't like that at all. I think well, where are you going to send that story? So your PR really should have the right relationship with the right journalist and say, do you know what? I can offer this exclusive to this person. If that doesn't work, offer it as an exclusive elsewhere, then spread the story more widely. And that's something I also wanted to emphasize with what Matt was saying, is that a big challenge now for us as PRs is that something that was incredibly fruitful prior to the pandemic, as Matt suggested, was getting journalists, to meet physically with your client. That could be great. That can't happen anymore. Equally, well, it's not as easily, it can happen on Zoom. Equally, a really powerful thing to use, and I can't stress this enough, and it's harder now because everybody's working at home, but there's a piece of equipment called the telephone. Pick it up and use it. I saw like a study the other day by a PR company saying, so many journalists don't want phone calls. Well, that's exactly why you should phone a journalist if you can. That's exactly where you get that interaction. That's exactly where you generate that rapport, and also you get to hear what the journalist wants to write about if they don't want to write about the story that you're bringing them. Prior to the COVID crisis, in nearly 15 years of PR, I'm not kidding, prior to the COVID crisis, I never got one piece of press coverage by writing an email to anyone. I always did it by picking up the phone. So this is much harder now. You do have to write. So make sure when you're creating those emails, if you're doing your own PR, which I wouldn't advise, but what your PR should be doing for you, when they're writing a pitch, they've got to keep it, because it's now email, they've got to keep it very short, very simple, 2 or 3 lines. This is the story. This is why it's interesting. This is the data. This is the information. Bang. You don't want to write great lengthy pitches. You can articulate them. You can understand them, you can really think about them, as Matt was saying, but ultimately you've got to distill them. And the PR has got to ultimately distill your message to find that middle ground, as I was saying, between your product and the news agenda, okay? And it can be done, but that's something that I just really wanted to put across.
Absolutely, thank you, that's great.
I think guys, one of the things that Alex has reminded me quite neatly of there is that if you're working with a PR, your expectations have to be reasonable about the time it takes them to understand what you do in order that they can properly represent you. So imagine that you've got someone working with you and you're expecting them to be picking up the phone and doing that pitch to the journalist, or perhaps sending a pitch email and then getting a response back. They've got to really know what they're talking about, because if a journalist then says, well, is it this? How is it different from this competitor's product? Because I'm sure that there's other people doing the same thing. You have to be able to explain very quickly, no, it is different because of these reasons. And you don't know what that question is going to be until you pick up the phone. And it's going to take at least a few weeks of working together and discovering and research on the part of that PR. So do bear that in mind when you're looking at your timescale for going out with a campaign, recruiting a PR person. It won't be successful if you call up or you engage someone via the work crowd and ask them if they can help you put out a press release next week. You know, that is not the way to start your campaign. And as I mentioned again, I can't say it often enough, you only get to launch once. You get one chance, and then it's done. You either done it well or you haven't. You need to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, I'm really pleased you mentioned that, actually, because a lot of clients often say, you know, how long do I need a PR person for? Can we just have them for a few weeks? And really, a few weeks is sort of fact finding and starting to create some messaging. You know, it needs to be for a minimum period of time. What would you say that period of time should look like in an ideal world? Would it be 3 months, 6 months?
I hesitate to put a time on it. I agree with Matt. It does take time for a PR to understand the business and the business model, and then be able to explain it as I could explain to my 8-year-old. I've got to be able to simplify it for you, but I've got to get through all the nuances and of what the product really is. I hesitate to put a time frame on it in terms of how much time you should hire a PR for. But one thing I personally always want to do as a PR is deliver impact very, very quickly. So once I've understood it, then I can do it. I tend to find, I mean, just me personally, this is just a personal thing. I love it when you get 3 months that tends to roll on. So you get the first 3 months, you know, and that gives you an opportunity to understand the clients, to generate some sort of rapport with them, and that's incredibly important. Because one thing we haven't really spoken about on this talk, we talked a lot about media relations, and client relations are so important now, because I see really good examples of where the PR actually becomes, if you like, a sort of a sounding board, very much an advisor, somebody who's confident enough to challenge them, actually, to help the client articulate their business position. Okay, so that kind of relationship takes time. It can happen over between, you know, a month to 3, I find, and it only gets better thereafter. I had a good example of a client that I worked with last year, thankfully, you know, through the work crowd, Alice. And I was sort of on the phone advising them very quickly. And once I was able to generate press coverage for them quite quickly, they trusted me a bit more. And with that trust comes a bit more advice. But it's horses for courses. It depends on your client and their company. You know, it depends on hierarchical that company really is, you know, how dynamic it is, and so forth, and your relationship with them. But that is very important. I mean, I would say, just briefly, without being too blunt, I would say that from a media relations point of view, you can get out there fairly quickly. You know, if it's a fairly simple product launch or fairly simple proposition, bam, we should be able to go fairly soon. But if I'm going to give you sort of strategic advice and a sort of an ongoing sort of feed of coverage, it's going to sort of really, you know, link into your overall plan, then, you know, I will need a little bit longer than that. I hope that does cover some of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about PR being used for for launches of new products or new information that's coming out, but PR obviously can be used in a whole host of different areas. Matt, I know you've been doing quite a lot in terms of using PR from an investment point of view to raise investment, but also from I think it'd be interesting for businesses to hear when they are looking to make cuts, how to manage their reputation during these cost-cutting times that many businesses may have to go through. I don't know whether either of you could share a bit of thoughts. Perhaps Matt, you could share some thoughts on the sort of investor side.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So I think actually it's more interesting perhaps to look at the reputation management side. And I was going to compare. I got a note from earlier that we should cast our minds back to 2008 when Lehman's went bust and we had the credit crunch, and that was the start of the last major recession. And I was a PR person in London at the time, with less years under my belt than Alex, having relatively recently left the army within a year before that. And it was really interesting to see how there was a lot of kind of slash and burn going on in the PR industry. People were getting rid of their PR agencies, so that meant, you know, for the knock-on effect for me was PR agencies weren't hiring. But I think things have changed, and I think the need to communicate with the market is now better recognized. And in a time of crisis and upheaval and uncertainty, it's very important for businesses to be able to communicate what they're doing to ensure themselves and explain how they're going to survive this crisis. And I think there's a suspicion now that if someone goes quiet at a time when a lot of businesses are struggling, that means that they're probably struggling because they aren't able to communicate, what they're doing about it. If they are continuing to have a presence, and I would include social media in this as well, but certainly sort of, their channels are being updated. They are putting out information on their own channels or on their website, and also talking about what they're doing. Then that can be very very powerful if they're able to actually prove any kind of expansion or any kind of adjustment that they're making that will convince their market and their customers that they are better set to weather the storm. The person who says nothing, the suspicion is going to be that actually that they are a rabbit in the headlights and not able to weather the storm so well. When it comes to, so you asked about the investment side, I think that I refer you back to what I was talking about there having to be an aim for PR, and PR for its own sake is pretty pointless. You have to have a good idea that this is going to help and assist a company in some way, and that might be gaining new customers, or indeed it might be setting oneself up for investment, and that's going to affect the messaging you put out and also the publications that you're likely to get into. In my experience, that investment can be a headline for the trade media. It's unlikely to be, unless it's very large, that you're going to get into a tier one, a national publication with that. But it is the kind of thing that you want to shout about, and journalists will tend to be interested in.
One question I've had through is really about the convergence of PR and marketing, and you've sort of touched a little bit around utilizing different social channels, but are you seeing, is this something you're offering? And certainly the work crowd, increasingly we're getting much more diverse projects coming through. Are you seeing that you're having to sort of develop your skill sets, or are you partnering up with other freelancers that can support you? How are you seeing the sort of merging of marketing and PR happening?
I'm certainly seeing it in terms of content creation, being able to write, for a range of platforms. I think in terms of the precision that marketing demands as well, when you're working with marketing people, that we are increasingly, we need to be better at measuring our results. I am seeing that. Having said that, I haven't had a client that's come to me and said, can you do an e-marketing campaign for me as well? But that said, I think there's one thing that we can certainly be doing as PRs, and we certainly should be doing, is broadening our skill set, so that whether that's e-marketing or web design and so forth, to account for that convergence. I would also say that, just to add to that convergence, I would say that there's a convergence now because there's fewer, traditional media channels. There's a convergence now between PR and journalism, actually, and marketing. It's all becoming one content hub creation. Now, I hope that journalists, stay journalists and stay independent. But sometimes as PRs, effectively, we have to fill in for them, as I was saying earlier, creating that content for them based on the data that our marketers supply us. So it is becoming, more of a blob in that regard. That's probably the least scientific term you'll hear this in, but it is this convergence of creating meaningful content, and the pressure is on all of us now to do that, is becoming greater.
Mm. And I see a lot of people requesting sort of PR for SEO purposes as well, to help rank in their websites, to then drive the sort of the sales funnels and leads into the business. Is that something you're noticing as well?
Absolutely, and that can be hard. That can be easier to do in some cases than others. When I was working for an online, when I was sort of in-house at an online, at a website a few years ago, what they wanted was they simply wanted coverage that was going to encourage people to click onto their website. That's how brutal SEO can be. But as long as you can sort of generate that interactive nature in your public relations, that's a really good idea. I mean, there's an example of that I'll give you. It's a rather brutal example. It's actually rather brilliant, and I wish I'd come up with it myself. But a PR agency did it a few years ago. They basically wanted to raise awareness of plastic in the sea. So what they did is they had a video of a fish tank on LinkedIn, and they said, if we don't get donations to this charity, there's more plastic, they're going to go into this fish tank. You know, so it's donate or the fish gets it. So that in a sense is a really good example of this sort of interactive PR that you're going to be getting, you know, that you want to be generating as well. Why go onto this website and click engage? And you've got to work out why they should do that. That's through sort of interactive information, interactive graphics and so forth, and a sense of reward if you can do all of that. So that there is an example of how you can, you know, two examples really, how you can kind of drive SEO but also drive engagement.
Two more questions have come in, so it'd be great to cover those off. What can a PR do differently from an in-house comms team? And the second, that was from Vanessa, and Abby's asked, what impact, if any, has COVID had on reputation management? Do they think PRs need to change the way they advise clients on rebuilding or maintaining reputation? So first of all, PR, what can they do? What can PRs do differently from an in-house comms team?
I think because they're outside the organization, they can bring a fresh pair of eyes to it. They can dare to ask the questions that an in-house can't. They can challenge their client a little bit more. They can get their client to explain it to them in simpler terms, because they're not expected to get the in-house language anyway. And they also circumvent because they're external, they sort of circumvent the if you like, the internal culture. And that really can help them sort of cut to it. And then they can be a really effective and quite creative sort of middleman, if you like, between the client and their product and the wider media. So it's that external consultancy really is critical.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And actually the one of the things I find is that I can have a conversation with a journalist who knows that I'm external to that company, and they know that if they say, look, Matt, I just don't understand why these guys are any different to those guys, that I won't take offense. And not taking offense is one of the first things. If you're very, very deeply embedded with a company,
yeah,
you think your brand is brilliant, and you suddenly come up against a journalist who's like, oh, you know what, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Actually, because the journalist knows that way is the way the conversation might go, they don't actually then want to have the conversation in the first place, because they know that to ask questions will potentially sort of you're questioning. And so if one as a PR can provide that service and say, well, actually this is what a journalist could ask. They could ask this, these are the hard questions, what about this? I think you're adding significant value.
It could be a very fruitful conversation. You can say, yeah, it's a really good point, I'll put that to them, and then you can build a report from there. Sorry.
And just to say there, there's often sort of peaks and troughs in the demand for PR. So you might have your core comms team, but tapping into an additional expertise, for a 6-month run or whatever, or 12-month or 3-month, actually could be quite useful rather than taking on a permanent person all the time. And then just quickly before we wrap up, impact of COVID. Do PRs need to change the way they advise clients on rebuilding and maintaining reputation?
Quite often, if you are, as I think, to be honest, probably most of our audience is here today, you are a smaller or small to medium brand, then preserving an existing reputation will be less of an issue than actually creating a reputation. I do think that we were talking, for example, about pivoting and also sort of the presentation of dealing with this crisis. So it won't be enough to just basically do PR exactly as usual or as it was before. One almost has to have within the list of questions is there a COVID-19 angle to this? Could a journalist ask about COVID-19? Is anything that we do or that we're trying to do impacted by those macro events? and and has our business been impacted, and therefore what do we need to say about that? So how it's going to be part of the macro picture for a while for all sorts of businesses. So being able to answer the questions which the journalist and indeed the man in the street would want to ask is always going to be important.
Yeah, absolutely. And just be very mindful of what a difficult time it is for many people, and many companies don't create a positive COVID message if there isn't one, or try to create a positive COVID story if there isn't one. Be kind of realistic and sensitive in your communications, but keep the longer view as well, because this crisis is going to go on for a long time. I do believe we'll come through it, but as a business, sort of keeping your eye on that longer view and where the next kind of business opportunities will pick up, as they eventually will. So I hope that's, I felt Matt gave a better answer than me, but I think that's something that I would.
Great. Well, Alex and Matt, thank you so much indeed for sharing your thoughts and insights. I've made plenty notes, so I'm sure the audience has as well. And, some key takeaways for me is about sort of the honesty of the communications and being relevant to today's industry. And actually, now might be a good time to start engaging. Certainly on the work crowd, we've seen an uptick in the number of projects that are coming through. So businesses are obviously feeling a sense of actually, now is a time to rethink, reboot, get their stories out, get the positive messaging out, and as we sort of move through these uncertain times. But thank you so much indeed. This is the second of our marketing series. We're hosting another event next week, which is knowing your audience, content marketing, and key messaging to boost engagement. So I think that will lead very nicely on from what you discussed today. So thank you so much once again, Alex and Matt, for joining us. We will be distributing the content out, both written content and giving people access to this PR and reputation management masterclass. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.